started and letting some more people get signed in to the webinar. So just hang on a few minutes. Okay, Eli, I've changed the presentation to you.
Okay.
Great.
And are we advancing 1, 2, 3?
Yep.
Excellent.
All right. Well, while we wait to see if anybody else joins us, if you can or can't hear us, let us know in the chat. If there are any technical questions or problems, just pop up in the chat and let us know, and we'll try to resolve it. I feel like we need some jazzy music to start us off right. Let's give folks one more minute. Okay. Well, we can go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining us. Welcome. And I wanted to give a quick introduction to who we are and what this is about. So, and again, if you have any technical issues, let us know in the chat box. And if you have any questions about the content that we go through in the presentation, please type those into the questions box, and then we can answer them at the end. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So the Pinchot Institute for Conservation is a nonprofit. We work nationally mostly, and we're based in Washington, D.C., but we have been working in the Delaware River Basin for several years. And we work on a variety of forest management and related issues, such as watershed management, carbon, sustainable forestry, etc. And so in the Delaware Basin, we've been working with a group called the Common Waters Partnership, which is a collaborative of dozens of organizations from federal to the state and local level, as well as nonprofits and land trusts and watershed organizations and concerned citizens and conservation districts, foresters, you name it, working together on natural resource management issues in the upper part of the Delaware Basin, north of the Water Gap, and mostly south of the New York City reservoirs. So we've been delving into lots of issues up there, dealing with our urban development and forest management and incentive programs to help private forest owners with management and preservation of their lands. And we've also gotten into climate adaptation recently, trying to translate what do the big climate models mean, what does that mean locally, and then what are some of the strategies we can do on the ground to help make sure we still get the values out of the forest that we're looking for, such as clean water, healthy air, habitat, forest products, etc., despite all the changes that are coming down the road, and some of which we've already experienced. So that led us to develop a climate adaptation plan, and now we have been working on a forest adaptation guide, which is where the content we're talking about today will come from. And the guide will be ready shortly, probably within the next week, and we'll share that with you all. But we wanted to go through the content and talk about forest management in the context of a changing climate. And before we get started, I wanted to thank the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, for supporting this project, and also thank folks from the state of Maryland who developed a forest adaptation guide for Maryland, which we were able to easily adapt for this geography. So there's a lot of good principles that apply to a lot of locations that we'll talk about in more detail. So I'll move this over to our conservation fellow, Eli Roberts. He's got a master's in forestry from Yale, and he's going to lead us through the topic. Eli?
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Here we go. Managing forests in a changing climate. Here's a map of basically where I'm going to be talking about the upper Delaware River Basin, mostly northern hardwoods forests, maple beech birch, mostly relatively small parcels. And we know definitely the forests here are important to many millions of people downstream for water quality and spraying out floods and habitat and recreation and all the things we know forests are good for. So although I'm focusing here, the management topics that I'll be going over are applicable to forests kind of across the Northeast. So they're more widely applicable than just in the basin, though that's where we're focusing. Here's a map of a section of the upper Delaware watershed. The light green color you can see is deciduous forest. And that covers about 3/4 of the land area here. 3/4 of the land area also is under private ownership, and it doesn't fully match up 1-to-1, but most of the land is forest, and that's mostly owned by private forest landowners. So the point of this is to show that the management decisions that private forest landowners make have big effects on what happens downstream. So here's my basic structure for the webinar. I'll talk briefly about how the climate is changing and how it's expected to change. I'll talk about how forests change regardless of any change in climate. And then I'll talk about what's going to change about how forests change given climate change. I'll go through what can be done and what resources there are. And I will say this is necessarily going to be kind of a survey of forest management ideas, and I'm going to aim to talk for 20 or 25 minutes, and then should have time for questions, so start thinking of them. Okay, temperature. We know it will keep getting warmer. Both hotter in the summer and low temperatures in the winter will not be as low. The growing season will be longer, both with earlier springs and later autumns, and lakes and rivers are going to melt 1 or 2 weeks earlier. It's already getting wetter, and it's expected to further get even wetter. We can expect more precipitation. Most of the increase is expected to happen in the winter months, so kind of the least helpful for growing plants. But it's also going to be more variable. You'll see in the next slide, we're going to have more precipitation that are considered heavy events or extreme events. So there's more temporal variation in when the rain comes. So though we'll get more rain, we maintain the possibility of having drought times too. Here's a couple of graphics that show that the heavy events or extreme precipitation the whole New England area in this dark purple corner up here shows the percent increase in the amount of rain that will happen in the top 5% of rainfall. So the distribution of rain is shifting toward these heavy events. So we're going to see these hotter temperatures continue to get hotter, and these higher precipitation numbers continue to get higher. Of course, there's some variability, or there's some uncertainty in climate projections. But these arrows here highlight that this 4 degrees Fahrenheit change in average temperature is the low end of the estimate. That's kind of under a low emissions scenario. And that ranges all the way up to 7 degrees by 2080 under a higher emissions scenario. So that's sort of, we're looking at that range, but regardless of where we end up falling within that, we can expect it to get a few degrees warmer. And you see something similar over here in the precipitation. So we're going to talk now about how forests grow. And of course, this is, I'm going to give the highlights of a class or two in just a couple minutes, but these are some of the important elements. So we know about seed dispersal, right? That's how trees make a new generation. Tree seeds come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and they move around in different ways. That's either, acorns being moved by squirrels and blue jays, or maple seeds being moved by the wind, things like that. So different trees have different mechanisms for spreading their seed around, and the seed can travel different distances. When tree seedlings are little, those sprouts respond to light, moisture, fertility, competition, and herbivory in different ways, and also depending on the site that they're on. So those are other factors that affect, even if seeds get to one place, that affects who gets to survive. Further, once trees get larger, their tolerance of shade and light conditions can also help to determine who are the winners and who are the losers. If a shade intolerant tree is overgrown, it doesn't thrive. But trees like beech, hemlock, and sugar maple are more shade tolerant, so they can sort of grow up in the understory. Stocking is a sort of general concept about how much can grow in a certain area. So this graph, you shouldn't worry about the numbers or kind of the specifics about it, but this shows the sort of basic relationship between the number of trees per acre, the basal area of trees per acre, which is also a proxy for their volume, and then the average tree diameter. So you can see that, say, at 250 trees per acre, at 110 square feet per acre of basal area, 9-inch average tree diameter, that has reached this line, which is generally the line above which, if any of these numbers get higher, some trees are going to start to die. So this is sort of the maximum full use of all the resources on site. So the point of this is that there's a natural limit to the amount of production that can happen on any one site, and trees will either sort that out amongst themselves, and we can also manipulate that with management. Trees also respond to disturbance, and by that I mean anything that damages plants. That can be large things like a hurricane or a tornado, or smaller, more localized things like insect damage or fire. Disturbance can be characterized by its intensity and its frequency. An important thing is that disturbances reallocate resources. So that's either light or nutrition or water that was being used by something that is not being used by it anymore. And something else is going to take that up, whether it's a new tree or an existing tree. And again, this is a natural process that we are trying to mimic with management, or that we can mimic with management. So how will climate change forests? We're going to see more pests and diseases. And that can be either a direct effect, like the hemlock woolly delgid on the left, which can expand and persist when winters don't get cold enough. And that will cause hemlocks to decline, die over several years. And then on the right, we see the emerald ash borer. I'm sure you've seen spindly ash trees losing leaves. This is not directly related to climate change, but it's another stressor on trees that helps make them susceptible to other climate stressors. Invasive species are expected to increase. You see here barberry and buckthorn, which are two problematic plants that grow in the understory of forests. And these are mostly problematic because of the way they interact with deer for their effects on the understory. So plants like this are resistant to deer browse, so that means deer will eat other things, which means that the invasive species take up a lot of space in the forest understory, which may be fine by itself unless we have the goals of trying to grow something else. We'll talk more about invasives later on. Species composition will shift. This is an interesting one. So these maps show the distribution of suitable habitat conditions by species, both in the present day and projected for the year 2100 under a high emissions scenario. And so what this shows is the conditions suitable for sugar maple are generally shifting away or becoming less suitable in the upper Delaware River region. But here for white oak, we're seeing them overall get more suitable. So the point of this is that different species will respond differently, of course, to a changing climate. As far as forest types, in general, the northern hardwoods of maple, beech, birch are going to shift towards a more oak hickory forest type. But of course, that depends on a lot of things. It depends on disturbance and establishment, and that also means that it could respond to management actions. So when you look at these maps, don't necessarily think, oh, this is fate, but this is where the tides are going. And there's an interesting resource, which I'll talk about at the end, about tree species. Next, I'm going to talk about the connection between higher rainfall, water quality, and fish habitat. When we get more rain at once, that means more rain is flowing on the surface rather than sinking into the ground. And that tends to mean worse water quality because that surface flow picks up sediment and nutrients. And that leads to worse trout habitat, or worse fish habitat generally, but especially trout, which are sensitive to that. You can see here a picture of a sedimenty river. And the decline in fish habitat is compounded by the decline in hemlocks. As winter temperatures don't get as low, hemlocks are able to shade streams. And so here you can see on the right a relationship between the green line, which is the upper limit of trout habitat temperature, and then the blue line is the actual temperature. This is at Callicoon, New York, at a station a few years ago. So this shows that the water temperature got too hot and was not suitable trout habitat, and we can expect to see more of that. In fact, even though this is a very coarse analysis, in general, many states across the Northeast are expected to see a dramatic loss of trout habitat by the second half of the century. Here you can see other pictures of flooding. I know you're familiar with this. We know that flooding contributes to runoff, nutrient sediment loads, stream bank erosion, and changes in the shapes of channels. Not to mention the damages to human infrastructure, notably including roads, culverts, and bridges and dams. We'll talk more about that too. Fire, the risk of fire is expected to increase as the climate warms and as precipitation gets more variable. But this is not at the same scale that it is out west. But just, it's another thing to think about. The WUI, or the wildland-urban interface, is sort of an index that considers both the density of human buildings and the density of vegetation. And so you can see here in northeastern Pennsylvania, at least, the orange and yellow are medium and high density intermix and interface of fuels and things that can be damaged by fuels. So that's important to think about. Here's another risk assessment map from the Forest Service, which shows a moderate to a high risk in the upper Delaware region where we're talking about. So we've talked about all the ways that forests will change, but it's important to remember that this is all in the context of disturbance, or knowing that forests change naturally anyway. So it's not a matter of preventing changes, either due to climate change or not, but guiding those changes closer to our goals and being able to accommodate the uncertainty. There's an interesting document that's coming out in the next several months from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science from the Forest Service, which goes into much greater detail about specific forest types and how they're expected to change given climate change. So, what tools do we have at our disposal? Silviculture is a big one, and this is the intentional management of vegetation through disturbance, and that can often involve harvesting. So some very basic categories. Thinning is removing competition from trees you want to grow bigger and better and faster. Regeneration treatments are focused on beginning a new generation of trees that can happen either in existing forest stands or in new ones. Like natural regeneration takes advantage of seeds that trees put out, or artificial regeneration involves planting. One thing we want to discourage, and most people you talk to will discourage it, is high grading, which is cutting only the nice trees. It's been described as cut the best and save the rest, or shooting the winning horse after it wins a horse race. This idea is that if you take all the best trees, you have nothing left to grow your future forest with. And luckily, there are a lot of interesting silvicultural techniques that can bring reasonable financial returns, and also have a ecological benefit. So with silviculture, here are the levers we can push on, or the things we can control. We can control the location, timing, and intensity of the harvest. We can control the pattern of cut, the soil disturbance, the size of canopy gaps, and the relative balance of species that get cut or kept. And all those can influence how the future forest develops. Here's a sort of textbook spectrum of different regeneration treatments, which range from single tree selection, which makes small gaps intended to regenerate shade-tolerant trees, all the way up through a clear cut, which makes large gaps intended to regenerate trees that are intolerant of shade. And of course, planting is another regeneration treatment, and that can be combined with several cutting patterns. Other tools we have besides silviculture are infrastructure and pest management, and we'll go through details on most of those. But silviculture, infrastructure, and pest management are the actual tangible management decisions that we can make to affect how our forests develop and grow. So it's important to come up with a plan first, and think about, where do you want to actively manage, and what do you want to either passively manage or preserve, however you want to think about it. And it's also important to consider, is that possible? I would say if you had an ash and hemlock stand, preservation is not an especially reasonable goal in the medium or long term. So knowing that those things are going to change, it's important to have a plan for that. And all these decisions that we're going to talk about, all these management techniques, involve trade-offs, either financial, aesthetic, or effort-wise. And so think about what your priorities are there. The point of this is that I'm going to talk about a lot of techniques, and they're not necessarily meant to be prescriptive, as in you ought to do this if you want to have a good forest for climate change. This is more a menu of things and situations in which they might be appropriate, but talk to your forester. An important point here is that healthy and diverse forests can handle stresses better. And I should have written this in, good forestry tends to match up pretty well with climate resilient forestry. So it's not like you have to come up with a whole new approach to managing forests. Most of what I'm going to talk about here is just good forestry, because good forestry spreads around risk and tries to make many different goals match up in the same piece of land. So most of what I'm going to talk about are just means toward a healthier and more diverse forest. The first thing to think about is density. A healthy density comes from timely thinning. As you can see in this sort of idealized picture here, the darker trees have been kept and the lighter trees have been cut. The nice trees stay, the not so nice trees go. The idea here is that you're applying a disturbance and reallocating the resources that these trees were taking up to the trees that you want to grow bigger and better. And here's a picture of how thinning might affect two trees of the same age with access to different resources. Another strategy is to diversify. We can think about diversity in a lot of ways. Two ways that I'll talk about on this slide are diversifying species and diversifying the age class of a particular stand. And when I say stand, it's a management unit of forest. In the picture here from British Columbia, you can see a clear-cut, patch removal, or a series of patch cuts, and a control unit. And I guess down here it's smaller patch cuts. So these are 4 different forest stands that have been subject to 4 different treatments. And what's going to grow up in these gaps is a new age class of forest. So young forest is going to come up here. And then on this scale, when we're looking at 4 or 5 different stands, then there would be diversity in age classes, at least between the forest that we see here and the new forest that will grow. Depending on how light is allocated in these gaps and what trees are around, you might see different species competing well in these small gaps versus this large gap. And that would be one way to diversify species. It also depends on what trees they chose to cut. So that's diversifying species, diversifying age class. Here's a graph of tree size in New York State in 2008 and how many acres are represented by trees of a particular size. And so the cutoffs here are something like up to 5 inches, up to 11 or 12 inches, and then 12 inches and above. So you see a majority of acres are represented in this saw timber size class. So that's an indicator that tree size is not especially well distributed across areas. Another way you can think about diversity is structure, both within a stand. This picture on the left has vegetation way high up and vegetation way down low, but not a lot in the middle. Whereas the picture in the middle, you can see the sort of mid-height vegetation. And so you could talk about structural diversity between these two stands. And you can also think about structure across stands. Go backwards for a sec. If you look at the boundary between this clear cut and this forest right here, that would be diverse vegetative structure. It's important to think about compaction. If you have particularly sensitive soils, a winter harvest might make sense. Then again, if you're going for soil disturbance, then it might not. But it's important to think about how your harvest activities will affect your soil. Connectivity is important to keep in mind. And this is the idea that habitats that are suitable for a certain thing are connected to each other. One important place to think about connectivity, or I would say an easy place, is riparian areas or places along waterways. Forests along waterways, like I mentioned, are useful for shading streams, but they're also useful for connecting patches of larger forest for things that move around in the trees. We know that climate change is going to spur the movement of plants and animals, and so connectivity between habitats can make that movement easier and make it easier for the natural world to adapt. Invasives, I mentioned before, something to think about is controlling invasives, especially shade-tolerant shrubs and winding vines. And there's a whole menu of ways you can do that, and different people have different preferences and priorities there. But an important thing to think about is, especially if you're going to cause disturbance in the canopy and reallocate light to the understory. In this picture, this is barberry, and it's more than happy to take that light. So if you're aiming to grow a new generation of trees, it makes sense to control this barberry first. And winding vines can, like bittersweet especially, I'm thinking, can wind around trees and girdle them and make them more susceptible to being blown over by the wind or things like that. And again, that's not inherently bad, but if you're trying to grow nice trees for any reason that you might want to, then it's important to consider that risk. We've all heard about overpopulation of deer, and here are some ways you can manage that, either by hunting or allowing hunting, fencing, or some research suggests that larger regeneration patches, kind of above the 20 to 25 acre range, have a higher survival rate of young trees in the middle of those patches because the deer are less likely to go up to the middle. So it's another way to overcome high deer populations without investing in hunting or fencing. Refugia are interesting things to think about too. Identify and maintain the especially cool or moist patches on your land. So that's either north-facing slopes or seeps or hollers or wetlands, anywhere that has sort of a different thermal environment. You can also consider connectivity here. If there's connectivity between wetlands, it might be nice to have a forested strip between them, things like that. So we know as suitable habitat moves north or moves upslope, it's going to be important to have these little patches. The next little section, I'll talk about water management. Riparian buffers, or forested riparians, are just patches of forest near to bodies of water. So where possible, or where it meets your other goals, plant, expand, or maintain your forest riparian buffers. And this will help control sediment and nutrients running into the water. It'll provide shade, and it'll provide habitat, both for things living in the water and the things living around the water. It's also important to retain fallen trees to slow runoff and improve habitat. Specifically about hemlock, we can expect that most of the hemlock is going to decline due to the woolly adelgid. And so plan for that, especially considering shade on streams, by underplanting other evergreen trees that grow near streams. And there's a really detailed and interesting guide from Pennsylvania in the resources list that we'll share at the end, which talks about species that you can use for that. Thinking about infrastructure, plan your forest roads using best management practices. I know that both New York and Pennsylvania have pretty detailed and relatively readable best management practices guides. And also foresters know about this, so talk to your forester or find a forester and talk to them about it. Also size your culverts for higher peak flows. We talked about having more heavy rain events, and that means that there's going to be more water flowing through your water infrastructure. And it's way easier to install a bigger culvert first, then deal with the consequences of a plugged culvert. Some other resources for culverts and stream crossings are here. The Nature Conservancy put out an economic analysis of road and stream crossings. That's available. Especially streamcontinuity.org has a climate-friendly crossings report or toolkit. So if you go to that website, you can find it in their resources tab. Stream bank restoration, it's important to restore degraded stream banks, both for habitat and for stability. And though it may be tempting or satisfying in the short term to dredge or clean out streams after floods, that can be counterproductive to the long-term stability and health of that. So I would say seek the guidance of professionals when you're making your when you're considering the trade-offs of stream action post-flood. It's also good to reconnect floodplains. You can see here on the Neversink River, these are floodplains that have flooded during a flood, and that has dissipated the strength of the water, which is useful to everyone downstream. Talk briefly about fire. These are two strategies that we've already talked about. Managing for healthy density. Healthier and vigorous trees can be less susceptible to fire. It can also be more difficult for fire to travel between the crowns of the trees if they're spaced wider apart. And also diversify species and age classes to spread out the risk that any particular patch will be fully damaged. If a fire of a certain intensity comes through, it might not affect different forest types in the same way. So it makes sense to have different forest types. Think about fuel breaks, either having your roads or your thinned areas where they might be useful if a fire were to travel across the landscape. We know that fire generally moves uphill, it moves with the wind, it moves where there's fuel. I'm not saying to go build a road to prevent a future fire, but if you are building roads, think of how that might fit into a fire plan. And then Firewise has really detailed home landscaping guides, and that's in our resources list as well. Pest problems, learn invasive plants, monitor and prioritize, because you can't kill them all. So think about what invasives are standing between you and your other forest management goals, and then prioritize those. As I mentioned before, especially controlling invasives before opening up light, planting, or harvesting. Harvesting contracts should have a provision for power washing the tracks, like you see here on this bulldozer. The seeds of invasive species can get stuck in the mud on these tracks and spread, especially things like Japanese stiltgrass along skid trails in your forest. So that's a pretty easy invasion to prevent. We talked about deer, we talked about diversity. Coming to the end, climate change is happening because there's more carbon in the atmosphere than there used to be. So keep forests as forests. And if you need to make them useful or financially valuable to keep them as forests, then that's often well justified. Another thing to do is grow nicer trees. The low value or the low grade wood products tend to be shorter lived. That's like pulp and paper and firewood. But the higher grade, the nicer logs get turned into things like floors and furniture and cabinets and things that last longer and store carbon for longer. So all else being equal, it's better to grow nicer trees. Think about growing new forests and protecting wetlands, because both of those habitat types sequester carbon and store it, especially wetlands, because they have low oxygen environments, and so the microbes that degrade wood aren't able to work as well. So very generally, as a summary, what we talked about the climate is changing, it's getting warmer, wetter, and more variable. We talked about how forests grow, compete, and respond to disturbance. We talked about how climate change is going to enhance and introduce stressors to trees and make forests in general more susceptible to disturbances of all kinds, even as those disturbances are getting more frequent. And then we went through kind of a survey of a toolbox of forest management tools for a healthy and diverse forest. And of course, this is complicated. So I encourage you to approach this at whatever level is comfortable or whatever level of detail is comfortable, and then seek out a little more information where it's interesting or relevant to you. And luckily, there are so many resources, and I'm going to go through just a few of those before I open it up for questions. So first, of course, spend time in the woods. That should be self-evident, and I'm sure it is. Join a woodland owners group and attend field tours. These are really interesting ways. I found it's essentially like time travel to see what a harvest looks like 20 years after it was cut, which would be so hard to envision without actually seeing it. So it's useful to see that. I went to Penn State's Forest Owners Conference this past spring out in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and it's really good, really useful, full of forest landowners from the Mid-Atlantic. I learned a whole lot there. Like I mentioned, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has their vulnerability assessment coming out. You can see the link there. And then a portion of that, which is available now, is how I think the 30 most common tree species are expected to respond to climate change under at least a couple of emission scenarios. So check that link out. And again, this is not to inspire resignation, but more to help you to think about where, kind of how the trees will tend to fare. Extension and state forestry have really good resources, especially Cornell and Penn State forestry documents. They're really readable. They're really focused on small landowners with varying goals. And I really encourage you to check those out. The links are at the end. Talk to private consulting foresters. It can seem expensive at first, but it really, really is worth it to have someone who knows all this stuff and knows how to balance all of these different goals talking to you. The U.S. Department of Ag has financial resources available to forest landowners, and I've been digging into that program, so feel free to ask me questions about that. That seems like a really useful and underused resource. And then finally, as Stephanie mentioned, we at Pinchot have been developing this guide, adapting it from the folks in Maryland. And so we have a 16-page version that covers the topics that I just talked about this past 45 minutes. It's going to be free at this commonwatersfund.org site, hopefully in the next week or so. And it's going to be free for download and distribution. There's also a 2-page back pocket summary version, which will be up at the same time. Pinchot and Common Waters also put out a more general climate resilience guide for the Upper Delaware region, which talks about infrastructure and development and other things that will respond to climate in addition to forests. So that's available at that link. And then if you want even more, there's a much longer adaptation guide for the Upper Delaware River region, thinking about climate change, risks and opportunities. Thanks again to our collaborators, including Pennsylvania DCNR, New York DEC, and the New Jersey Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service helped to support this project, and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has done and is doing really interesting and really relevant work. Also check out mywoodlot.com for forest planning tools. And if you're in their area, the Delaware Highlands Conservancy has really great resources and programming. So thanks. Here again is the link to the a link to the guide and the other resources that I talked about. And also feel free to email me at eliroberts@pinchot.org. I'm happy to either answer your question or more likely send you to a person who can answer it better. So thanks a lot. I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Thanks, Eli. So I haven't seen any questions pop up in our questions box, but does anyone have any questions? I can unmute you if you'd prefer to pose your question over the phone. You can also raise your hand in the dashboard there to indicate that you have a question. Well, Eli, I think we must be doing a good job then at presenting this material. We've stumped our audiences today.
There you go.
But that's okay. So, yeah, if you all think of any questions later on, feel free to contact Eli, and we're happy to provide you with more information. Also, do visit the Common Waters website, the Forest Adaptation section. We are adding a lot of new content there and updating that, and we'll be also sharing this forthcoming forest adaptation guide within the next week or so with everyone who's registered for the webinar.
Sorry. I will say that the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, even though their vulnerability assessment hasn't come out yet, they have a lot of, they have a lot of other really interesting resources. So if you just go to forestadaptation.org, they have things for the Mid-Atlantic already published, and then for other regions of the country. Yeah, so go check that out. They have really good stuff.
Yes, I second that recommendation if you're interested in learning more. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and we hope you have a good evening.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care.